Chapter 5. At this time, Dr. J.C. Carruthers, who in 1950 had retired as director of Mathare Mental Hospital in Nairobi, was asked by the UK government to write about the Mau Mau from the point of view of a psychologist-psychiatrist. His psychology of Mau Mau was the result, and I read. The Kikuyu have shown more avidity for learning over the years than has any other tribe in Kenya, with such effect that an unduly large population of the people who reach the higher levels of education in this colony are Kikuyu. There are also many who have failed to make the grade they aimed for and, although unfitted to take well-paid jobs, are also unfitted, in their own eyes, for more menial work. Many others, again, have had but trifling formal education, or even none at all, and this applies to the great majority of women. There has thus developed a great diversity within the tribe, but in general it can be said that no matter what educational level has been achieved, and no matter what success in business, and many of the wealthiest are uneducated, these people still have found that many doors remained as tightly shut as ever. Much bitterness has arisen on this score, and this feeling has developed at all educational levels. Except in relation to their own people, the acquisition of power by education has been strictly limited. In the eyes of their own people, however, an astonishing prestige attaches to their educational achievements, however great or slight these may have been, and has given them tremendous power for good or evil in that field. Christianity contains the principle that all men are equal under God with equal rights. African people in transition attach more importance to example than to precept, but here in Kenya they do not think they see the practice of this principle by people who are white. Many Christian missions have done noble work, and many missionaries practice Christianity themselves. Many Africans, under the influence of these, have had the vision of greatness and, in some measure, have acquired Christianity. But they have then emerged into a wider world and have found there that white and supposedly Christian people have after all an exclusive group religion like the one they used to have themselves. Their seniors of the tribe, who never lost their traditional allegiances and are not surprised or shaken and can say to them, "We told you so." And so the ones that hate us most today are often Christian Africans. Prospective immigrants to Kenya should be interviewed by a selection board to assess their qualifications for living in a land where their every act will have a much wider repercussion than is the case in the land that they aim to leave. At GHQ, I was astonished to find that while some people worked overtime, GHQ's effort at beating the Mau Mau was essentially run on office hours. Evenings and weekends seemed to be sacrosanct free time. They were leisure hours, in which one was encouraged to indulge in one's hobbies, particularly if they were outdoor sports. At GHQ Intelligence there was a large operations room with maps around the walls, supervised by an ex-Women's Auxiliary Air Force WAF officer. Several other offices were also used, the largest being occupied by Major Holmes and his regular Army assistants. Two others were used by short-term contract Army officers, Captain Young, who I thought a nit-picking twit, and Captain Butt, who had Kenya family connections. Although he was not particularly bright or zealous, he knew something of Kenya, which was an advantage. Besides the ex-WAF who ran the operations room, there was another whose fiancé had been killed in the war. She and I were ordered to start a card index resource, the objective being that by keeping records on active Mau Mau gang members, more would be learned of their organisation and movements. For the next 4 months we sifted through intelligence reports, captured Mau Mau documents, laboriously building the index. Some Kikuyu names were so popular it was easy to have duplicate entries, but slowly we learned, and gradually the pictures emerged, and the work became useful. One captured message read, "These Europeans, can they not understand us? They have their heroes of freedom that they admire, such as Robin Hood. Was he not like us? Did he not fight to rid his country of the Norman invaders? Aren't we trying to do the same thing with the Europeans? What can't they understand?" Yes, well, he has a point, I thought, but I never read of Robin's outlaws having obscene oaths and bestial behaviour, but perhaps they did. Another read, "Beware going near Bwana Ken Cunningham's farm. If he points his gun at you, you will be dead." Ken Cunningham and his family had a modest farm on the Rumaruti Road out of Tea Falls backing onto the Marmonet Forest. Well done, Ken. Not only are you a charming, God-fearing man, excellent at tennis, with 3 lovely daughters, but you're putting the shit up the Mickeys. Occasionally there was some humour in the job. A document came to my desk written by an Asian Dukawala. He complained bitterly about his lack of security, arguing vehemently that he needed a gun license for my own self-protection. Huh. These Asians don't need any help in self-protection, I thought. In addition to building the records department, I was asked to help John Dykes, son of the Tea Falls butcher and rancher, to interrogate senior Mau Mau who had agreed to cooperate. John spoke Kikuyu as well as Swahili, and these interrogations followed prescribed lines. In particular, we tried to learn of the habits and weaknesses of the Mau Mau leaders that might be turned to good use by the Emergency Armed Forces and Special Branch. An enthusiastic officer who had lost his leg in Malaya came out from UK to join Major Holmes's team. One day I heard him rushing into Major's office declaring that the answer to this Mau Mau business was that we have to get into the forest and live there, operate like they do. Dear God, has it taken the British Army all this time to come to such a conclusion? In the Kenya Regiment we've been saying this for ages. Isn't George Hales doing this sort of work already? Didn't he get General China, the most capable and brave of the Mau Mau military leaders? Anyway, perhaps the professionals are getting the message at last, I thought. In Nairobi I started playing tennis again, and once I travelled to Tea Falls to play rugby there. The team was nowhere near the standard of the triumphant team of the previous year. Having proved a point, their stars had decided they could no longer afford the time and were staying on their farms. To my pleasure, well into his 50s, Davo was playing as hooker. One could always rely on him to be grafting away in the boiler house, I thought. This match was against the police, comprising in the main lads quite recently out from the UK. In no time, animosity started to flare, and Mickey Milan, the excellent referee, was having trouble in keeping control. At one scrum, our front row reared up as Davo complained in aggrieved tones that he had been deliberately kicked by his opposite number. At the next pile-up, as we extricated ourselves, the opposing hooker was seen to be lying senseless on the turf. "Pressure points," whispered someone to me in awed tones. "Davo, will you please come here?" asked Mickey. "Look, Davo, I can't prove it, but I'm pretty sure it was you who was responsible for that. Don't say anything, just listen to me. Any further incident and you will be off." The police played on with 14 men. No substitutes were allowed in those days, and the match ended without handshakes. In Nairobi, I joined the cathedral choir, finding to my surprise it was an adult choir, the sopranos consisting of women only. My next-door neighbour was a fine bass who had sung with Gioli Karte Opera Company in the UK. He couldn't read music, but he certainly had a good voice. I met Dorothy from the Durban Castle days, and she introduced me to Scottish dancing at the Kirk Hall, and to her friend Anne Carpenter. I had a new dinner jacket and trousers tailored, and left them in my van while I went to the cinema. They were not there when I returned, of course. Besides Anne, who became a girlfriend at this time, I was also in correspondence with Audrey, a Kenya girl who was now in Salisbury training to be a nurse. Her family lived in Nairobi, and I got on exceptionally well with them. Her grandparents also lived on the family plot, in 2 separate cottages, communicating in writing only. And I performed the job of best man for Doug Miles, a regiment friend. He married Pamela Rose Innes, a lovely brunette who I first met at a dance in Nakuru before I went to Rhodesia. And 8 years later, by which time Pam and Doug had 3 daughters, I was summoned to witness in court, as part of their divorce proceedings, that I had seen Pam having lunch with a coffee farmer who was being cited as co-respondent. Witness to the marriage and witness to the divorce, I mused without enthusiasm. Later I met Terry Coulson, my one-time Sergeant Major of B Company, at his family home in Nairobi. He was in love with Audrey Levette from Tea Falls, over the moon about it. "You'll know when you've met the right girl, Ozzy," he proclaimed. Audrey was the sister of Ken Levette, with whom I had been talking about starting a joint farm, next to his parents' farm. The intelligence work at GHQ was growing. A significant development was the arrival of ex-wife Joan, née Vivian, married to a Dane who was director of city breweries in Nairobi. She was a specialist in photographic interpretation. Her war service had been of considerable importance, so much so that she led the WAF contingent on the ticker tape parade in New York. She told how one of her photographic interpretation team had seen camouflage being moved from over the German ships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which were holed up in port. Joan had rushed the news to the Naval Command, who were totally unimpressed, resulting in the embarrassing escape of the pocket battleships up through the English Channel and out into the North Sea. She also told how they had been able to identify that the first German jet-propelled plane had flown. On their aerial photographs they spotted unusual melted marks in the snow. When they measured them, they found them to be the exact distance apart of the jet engines on the prototype, as given to them by intelligence reports. Finally, Joan had been a British representative with the Americans, estimating from photos the damage inflicted by the atom bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In GHQ Nairobi, Joan's job was, in collaboration with the RAF, to set up a photographic interpretation service. The RAF would fly photographic runs over the forest. These runs would be recorded as a date, time of day, height and approximate location. The prints would then be run in pairs under stereoscopic lenses that would throw them up in 3D for the interpreter, peering through the lenses to identify Mau Mau activity and, more importantly, Mau Mau camps. Troops would then be sent in on the ground to find and destroy these camps and kill any inhabitants. In the event, some troops said they found nothing, by implication inferring that Joan had got it wrong. But we noticed, however, that the Black Watch always found the camps, exactly as Joan had described them. The Black Watch were thorough, determined soldiers. Attempts were also made to bomb the sites. This was difficult. The terrain was not always easy to identify from the air. Later intelligence reports suggested that, after their initial alarms, the Mau Mau had become quite indifferent to the raids. Even when accurately dropped, the bombs penetrated into the soft soil and did little damage. As with the other ex-WAFs, Joan worked with great diligence and commitment. It was not long before the volume of photos started to overwhelm her, and I was asked to join her. In the first instance, my job was to locate on the map the exact coordinates of the photographic run, and then identify the map references of the targets found. Soon Joan was teaching me interpretation, so that I could do preliminary screenings for her. Also, she performed a party trick for me. She claimed to have helped forge secret agent documents in the war. Seeing my disbelief, she asked me to write out my signature. 3 minutes later, she brought me her forgery, and I couldn't tell which was which. I took some leave up at Eldoret on Non's farm. Anna started teaching me how to throw the javelin. Non and I made some sceptical plans of how we might go into business together in Eldoret once the emergency was over. We talked of opening a grocery shop and linking it somehow with his farm produce. I played for the Kenya Regiment in the Kenya 7-a-side rugby. Our captain, Captain Julian Marshall, was an attacking centre. Our scrum half was a friend of his who seemed to play the wrong tactics for 7-a-side. But we had some excellent players, for example Lofty Reynolds on the other side of the scrum from me. Our hooker was an excellent young centre. By now I was aware of who were the weak referees and used this to disrupt Harlequin's line-outs, so we beat them. In the final we were up against the Nondies, who I used to train with. We were now all very tired, and towards the end Lofty Reynolds slipped the ball to me on our 25-yard line, and I set off for the far line in the knowledge that Don Darroch, the fastest swing in Kenya, would surely overhaul me. However, his speed had been drastically reduced through fatigue apparently, and it was an old friend, Eddie Bristow, who used to play for Harlequins in the UK, who kept extremely fit, who caught me as I plunged over the line. Anyway, I had scored a 75-yard try at the last gasp, and we still lost 10-3. With Non's cousin, Heine Kruger, Non and I drove to Londiani to represent Western Kenya against the British Army. Non played prop as usual. Heine and I were the flankers, and Phil Roberts had appeared from somewhere to play in the centre. That morning I started sweating. Damn it, must be the recurring malaria. I swallowed some malaria tablets. During the first half I was astonished to see how much ground Heine seemed to cover. He seemed to be much fitter than I was. Phil was having a difficult time with a knee injury. His opposite number wandered by him and scored a try. Phil went off and I was moved out to the centre. Our fly half was Scotty Menches, and the outside centre was his brother, Bobby. The army backs were pretty lively, especially a wing from the Devon Regiment. Anyway, soon after I moved to the centre, the man I was marking decided to wander through again. He was not heavy, and I lifted him off the ground and dumped him back onto it without ceremony. Thereafter there was little trouble, and we won comfortably. That match was the end of the rugby season, and a few days later I was at the Impala Club where cricket net practices were starting. I bowled a few of my left armers and retired to the bar to meet Audrey, who was back from Rhodesia. Throughout the next week we met in the evenings at her family home. "Audrey, I'll have to go. I have the most terrible headache." My head was pounding. Back in my room at Kenya Regiment HQ, I looked in the mirror. My reflection seemed to be exceedingly fit and not in the least unwell. Next day was the same, a splitting headache, my neck was stiffening, and my left arm was losing strength. "I think you've got polio. Just lie still and I'll get an ambulance to take you to the hospital," said the doctor. I was driven through the unimposing gateway of the British Military Hospital, BMH, with its sentry standing outside the Rondavel reception hut. Inside stretched tree-lined roads running alongside corrugated iron Nissen huts. This was the hospital. After a most uncomfortable lumbar puncture to check that it was indeed polio that I had, I was put to bed in the isolation ward. It was the 9th of September 1954. There was no polio vaccine in those days and no cure. The amount of paralysis could not be predicted. It would last for life, the muscles in the affected limbs deteriorating irrevocably. In considerable pain for 2 weeks I lay alone in the isolation ward. The only people allowed in were medical and nursing staff, and British Army NCOs, paid a risible amount of danger money as orderlies. It seemed to me the doctors and nurses stayed as far away as possible when speaking to me, hopelessness in their faces. "Just lie as still as possible for 2 weeks until the paralysis has run its course," Then you can set about recovering as much as possible over the next 2 years, said a doctor. Joan came to the little window at the end of the ward and shouted encouragement. Audrey, bless her, insisted that she be allowed in, as she was now a nurse. She sat on my bed with total confidence that the Almighty would protect her. She gave me a much-needed mental and emotional uplift. There were still 1 or 2 crises to pass. The iron lung was started up next to my bed one day, because I seemed to be having so much trouble breathing. Eventually the 2 weeks were over, and it was obvious the main paralysis was in my left arm and shoulder. The doctor explained that the extent of a polio victim's paralysis seemed to depend on the amount of exercise he had taken between the initial fever and the day the paralysis set in. I had played my last game of rugby on the day of the fever. The subsequent left-arm bowling in the nets had apparently directed the paralysis to those muscles. The paralysis tended to be concentrated on my left arm triceps and other outside muscles down my hand, where my fingers were pretty lifeless. I discovered I couldn't lift a bar of chocolate, and I had to use gravity to straighten the arm. Allowed out of bed, I started exploring, meeting other patients such as the army dog handler, who had been badly burned saving his dog from their truck, which had caught alight during a crash. One afternoon I wandered into another ward and made up a bridge for. Next morning I lay in bed awaiting my physiotherapist, Barbara Chambers, a stocky blonde. A small party walked to the bottom of my bed. I looked up to find facing me a friendly young National Service doctor, flanked by the matron. Sergeant Osborn, he spoke quietly, slowly, as though embarrassed. I am instructed to inform you that you have committed a grave breach of military discipline. You were seen yesterday afternoon to be playing cards in a ward reserved for officers. This is not to happen again, please. It was difficult not to feel sorry for oneself. I had my record player and became much attached to the Max Bygrave song, "With friends and neighbours, you're the richest man in town." Once out of isolation, I felt able to write home and tell my parents of the extent of my illness. Mum's reply included, "I have told Uncle Leslie, who has checked and assures me you are in very good hands there." Good for Uncle Leslie, I thought. Never been overseas in his life, even if he is head of London Transport and Medical Resources. So the days drifted by. None visited me. The RAF came in and gave me some photos they had taken recently flying over Mount Kilimanjaro. Surely they hadn't been looking for Mau Mau there. One incident amused me greatly. A large Chevrolet drove slowly in through the gate. All the officers seated outside their wards sat up agog. This must be a senior military man. The copious automobile crawled around the square, stopped, and out of it appeared a private in the Kenya regiment who had come to visit a friend in the other ranks ward. Disappointment was clearly discernible among the officers. It was now midway through October. I was being treated by a regular army officer physiotherapist, an embittered, forthright woman who had lost her fiancé in the RAF in the war. Other than her knowledge, her resources were zero. I felt as if I had been stripped of my British passport, my nationality. If I had been a British Army National Serviceman, I would have been flown back to the UK for specialist treatment, as were all those in the British forces who contracted polio at the time. But I had been called up in the emergency services in Kenya, and as such, I was not a British Army conscript. My physiotherapist announced that A, I must get use of my fingers, particularly the thumb and first finger, and B, I must be able to drive a car. So she made a splint which was bandaged to the underside of my forearm, from which, over my fingers, a frame rose, dangling elastic strings to each finger. This helped me to exercise my fingers by pulling against the elastic. Also, on a wall, she screwed a driving wheel at chest height, which she told me to spend time rotating. My van had its gear lever on the steering column, so it was not too difficult for me to drive with my right hand only, my left arm and hand being immobilized by the splint and sling. I drove up to GHQ, where Joan now had a Kenya Regiment officer assisting her. In the records section there was a new girl, Donette, just up from Rhodesia. While she was quite attractive to look at, she seemed to have a loud voice which did not appeal to me. Apparently she had fled a relationship in Rhodesia to be near her mother, who was in Nairobi, in the Mathare mental hospital. I was released from BMH and returned to Regiment HQ, where I prepared for my discharge with an official 16% disability. The physiotherapist had recommended as much swimming as possible, so I went to the Salisbury Hotel pool, where I had frequently gone for exercise previously. Whereas then I had been quite a competent swimmer, now I had to suffer the thought of how skeletal my arm looked. I had to push it out in front of me with the right arm in order to do the breaststroke. Freestyle looked lame and one-sided. I started rug making to strengthen my fingers. Onto graph paper I drew the Kenya Regiment badge, bought relevant wool and completed a rug. Also I started experimenting with short story writing. Surely I had reached the bottom now. 2.5 years fighting the mau-mau, malaria, polio. Donette and I started going out together. The weeks drifted by, going to physio, swimming in the pool, dating Donette. I had never felt so relaxed with a girl. There was no question of sex. We seemed content and happy in one another's company. Oh God, what am I getting into now? Please show me if this is for long term or not. I visited Donette's mother in Mathare. She was an attractive, brittle lady who kept herself occupied making quilt bedspreads, etc. Donette had indeed left a boyfriend, Bill something or other, in Rhodesia. She posted a letter to him confirming that their relationship was finished. She had some debts for clothes outstanding in Salisbury, and we agreed how they would be paid off. It was now the beginning of December. My arm was so weak I couldn't tie a tie, and there were 2 nightclubs in Nairobi, and we danced away the evenings there to songs such as "Don't Have to Buy Me Diamonds and Pearls, Champagne, Sables and Such." I never cared much for diamonds and pearls, 'cause honestly, honey, they just cost money. Little things mean a lot. She was staying at the YWCA, and this particular Saturday night I returned her there as usual, having agreed to pick her up the next morning. I noticed a car standing in the road outside. Sunday morning I called for her. Her door was locked from inside. She didn't answer. I climbed a bank at the back of the block, from where I tried to get a look into the window. Through a gap in the curtains I could see she seemed to be lying in bed. Someone found a spare key. We went in. She lay on her back, an automatic pistol in her hand against her temple. I took the automatic out of her hand and lay it on the bed. "Right, ring for the police," I instructed. I looked around the room. There was no message visible, nothing. I opened the drawers for some indication of what had caused this nightmare. The police arrived. I went outside and sat waiting on a low wall alongside George Hales, who was visiting his fiancée. "Yes, I was the last to see her. I returned her here safe and sound last night," I told the police. Later that week at the police station, I was grilled at length. "Why did you move the pistol?" "To make sure it was not fired again." "Why? Were my fingerprints the only ones on the gun?" "Yes. But that's ridiculous. The gun was in Donette's hand." "We only have your word for that. You were the first in the room, and you sent the others out to call for us." The police were young, aggressive Europeans who seemed to be trying to make up for their inexperience with bullying tactics. On one occasion when I went to the police officers for questioning, I saw Anne leaving in tears. She avoided eye contact. What had they been saying to her? For 3 days I was in shock. When I wasn't walking round in a trance, seeing Donette appear wherever I looked, I sat in a chair in the sergeant's mess, sideways to the room. More than once I heard the quickly hushed words when I appeared, "There's no smoke without fire." I went to see her mother at Mathari. She was in a mischievous mood. "Well, you'd have been in the way when Bill came up from Rhodesia. Oh, while you're here, I seem to have a pain in my breast. Would you please put your hand here and check it for me?" I turned and left. There was nowhere to go for peace. I went to her funeral, of course. As I was leaving, a woman hurried angrily up to me. "It was your fault. Why wouldn't you leave her alone?" I turned away blindly in tears. At the court of inquiry, I had to identify Donette. They produced a series of photos of her lying there, dead. The questioning started as to why I had moved the pistol and then opened the drawers in her room. Suddenly the magistrate announced that he was not satisfied with the police work in the case. He wanted the inquiry to be initiated again and completed more thoroughly. So the newspapers' reporting stopped at where I had removed the pistol and opened drawers. It offered suspense and potential drama for their readers. I went down to the police station for more grilling. This time the officers were competent. I discovered that Bill McSomething or other had indeed been in the car I had noticed and had now returned to Rhodesia. The police asked me about black magic. Apparently they thought that Donette could have been dabbling in it. Back in court, the new inquiry went through everything again. At the end of it all, the magistrate pronounced, "No offence committed by any person." I continued my visits to the BMH, being lambasted by my physio for not trying. One day I just sat there with tears streaming down my face. I walked round Nairobi in a daze. One morning in Delamere Avenue, a form refused to move out of my way. My eyes slowly focused on a clergyman from the cathedral. I didn't know him well and was surprised to be accosted by him. "Young man," he said, "you must stop blaming yourself. You may be very fortunate. Her mother is in Mathari, and you have no way of knowing that some family weakness would not have come through to Donette. You must stop blaming yourself. You have nothing to blame yourself for." I hired a lawyer to write to the governor about possible compensation for my disability from polio. The governor retorted that I had decided where to go on leave on Non's farm, and that was where I had caught polio, so the responsibility was mine. I asked the lawyer to contact the British Legion. The British Legion regretted they could not help because I was not in the British forces. The lawyer asked me for my further instructions. I gave up. I tried resuming rugby for Nondi's second 15, but found I dropped the scoring pass or failed to make the important tackle with the left shoulder. My physiotherapist was not amused when I complained to her about it. In fact, a positive result of no more rugby was that I never had rugby-created long-term injuries to knee or hip. I went and watched Anne, Dorothy and other friends performing in a Scottish dancing demonstration that I had been due to take part in. One morning I was sitting with regiment friends in the Stanley Hotel lounge when an elderly lady, a Mrs. Murphy, approached us. We had seen her written up as a heroine in the East African Standard recently. In an Irish rage, she had put a couple of armed Mau Mau to flight by hurling tins from her shopping bag at them. "Would someone please come and spend a night or two with her?" she asked. She hadn't slept for weeks. I volunteered, and with my Colt .455 I spent 2 uneasy nights in her secluded house on a coffee plantation outside Nairobi. After which I persuaded her to move out and join her daughter, who had already moved out, in greater security in Nairobi. The Stanley Hotel Lounge was a regular meeting place for Kenya Regiment personnel and their friends. One morning there was a bellow as a familiar large form burst through the door. It was Boet Odenhall. "Man, let everybody know I am looking for a wife," he announced. He found a space and plonked himself down amongst a group of friends. "Man, you should see where I've been, Rooty. Man, there are 3 gorgeous dames up there, the Carr sisters, Roy Neck Biscuit family heiresses. Man, are they worth a lot of shillings. The eldest is worth 400,000 a year, the second 300,000 a year, and the third, well, I didn't bother with her. She's only worth about 100,000 shillings a year." There was an uncomfortable silence. "By the way," he turned to the girl sitting next to him, "sorry, I didn't listen well. What's your name?" "Oh, don't bother about me," was the reply. "I'm just the 3rd sister." I received a letter and large photograph from Valda, announcing she had married a sergeant in the US Air Force. In the 1955 New Year, I was finally discharged from the regiment and rejoined the veterinary department for the last stretch of my 4-year contract. This would consist of 6 months' work and, finally, 6 months' home leave. At the veterinary department laboratories in Kibet, a ridge of land on the northern outskirts of Nairobi, I was received with sympathy. I was to work in the diagnostic laboratories, and my hours would allow me all the time I might need for therapeutic exercising, such as swimming. In the labs I was taught how to prepare and read slides, so I could help to diagnose the main tick-borne cattle diseases, such as East Coast fever, anaplasmosis and redwater. There were also anthrax slides, and I learnt of the fearful danger of anthrax. One could contract it just by leaning over a dead animal. I shared a bungalow with a European of British descent from South Africa who was in the accounts section. He seemed to be quite brainless and a supreme example of the allocation of a job through colour prejudice. John Osborn, who had shared the cabin with me on the Durban Castle, was still in the veterinary department, working out his contract like me, I suppose. Anyway, at this time my salary checks mistakenly started going into his bank account. This caused me some embarrassment when one of my checks bounced because there was not enough in my account to meet it. One day I was talking to Mr. McDougall, a senior veterinarian at Kibet. "I've been reading in the paper today the results of some American research. It seems to show that blacks are inherently less intelligent than we are. What do you think?" "I think that's complete rubbish. We humans are all of equal intelligence potential." "Oh, thanks." I was feeling sorry for myself. I read the Book of Job. I drove down to Naivasha to collect my trunks of clothes and books. I went into the locked store. The only item still there, inside one of the trunks, was a handwritten manuscript of some barbershop ballads I had taken down at school some 7 years before. The thieves had taken my diary, everything. Back in Nairobi, I asked to see the Director of Veterinary Services. He was now the Mr. McEwen, who had been deputy to Mr. Hammond, and who 2 years before had attempted to persuade me to accept deferment of my call-up. He remembered well my insistence that I do my military service. "You should have insured your effects," he said. His secretary showed me the door. There were tennis courts at the Kibet Club, and I found that, with care, I could throw up the ball to serve without hitting myself in the face. However, I had difficulty keeping my feet. Where before polio my left arm had been used for balance, in effect it was no longer there. I found myself sliding and falling around the court. My old Canterbury Cathedral choir master, Gerald Knight, now director of the School of English Church Music, arranged to visit Kenya, and he dropped me a line regarding his flight to Nairobi. So I went down to the airport and was somewhat put out to find that there was a large posse of church and music dignitaries waiting to greet him. I stood on the outer fringe. When he came towards us, his eyes ranged over the bigwigs until they alighted on me. "Ah, Ian, how great to see you," he said as he put out his hand, parting the assembled company, and came through to shake me warmly by the hand. After a brief exchange, he had to get back to his duties, of course, and it was the last time I ever saw him. As my choir master in 1937 to 43, he had been an uncompromising perfectionist. We choir boys had resented this and yet admired him, and we worked hard day in and day out to attempt to achieve the results he was after. At Quebec, one of the lady scientists was a breeder of boxer dogs, and she sold me a bitch puppy. I made friends with veterinarian Roy Ansell, and we paired up at contract bridge at the veterinary department club. The Quebec Vets Labs included quarantine kennels and the country's artificial insemination centre. Research was ongoing concerning mineral deficiencies in Kenya livestock. I went out on work trips with Roy investigating disease outbreaks such as black quarter, gangrene of ruminants caused by Clostridium. The van began to irk me. Although reliable, it was rather boring. I started looking into second-hand car showrooms, where I met a salesman I knew from the regiment. He persuaded me to trade in the van for a Citroën Light 15. It was front-wheel drive, had a long bonnet, and its gear lever was in the dashboard. Driving it, I felt like a king. Unfortunately, this one was eating a lot of oil. It wasn't long before the engine seized up, and I had to buy an expensive replacement engine. I found time to get away, back to Subukia and T-Falls, where I played my last game of rugby in the front row alongside Davo. "Hello, Cobber, how you doing?" "Oh, all right, thanks, Davo." He knew about my arm, and I had heard about his latest escapade. With the Australian journalist in tow, who was writing him up, Davo, with his small entourage of Askaris, had stumbled on a gang of about 45 Mau Mau. Davo had gone charging in with his Beretta and had met a hail of bullets from precision weapons. 11 bullets had hit him. What none of us had ever known was that he wore a bulletproof vest. The bullets had knocked him over, and some of them had been deflected into his stomach. The Mau Mau had withdrawn as the journalist rushed forward and dragged Davo out. In hospital, the bullets had been extracted, and now here he was playing rugby again. Astonishing. This country was getting into my blood. I wanted to stay here. I contacted Bill Turnbull, who was now back at his job as a manager on the Brookbond Tea Estates up in Kericho. Bill showed me all round the large complex and offered to put forward my name to start as an assistant manager there. Back in Nairobi, I discovered that a 6-week Kiswahili immersion course was to be run at the government-subsidised Jeans School. My veterinary department colleague supported my application, and in May I joined the course with another 20 adult students. We ranged from teenager Gillian Kane, a sandy-haired, freckle-faced physical training instructor at a nearby school, through school teachers Peter and Valerie Lane, up to the old man of the course, a senior magistrate whose salary increments had been stopped for some years because of his inability to pass the necessary Swahili examinations. His pronunciation was excruciatingly English, but he worked hard and passed the exams, including, to everyone's surprise, the oral. Our tutor was a Scot, Mac, a man who loved languages to the extent that he tried to learn a new one each year. He was very knowledgeable and exacting, yet humble with all of it. I threw myself into the course with enthusiasm, working particularly hard at the pronunciation. Mac thought I might get a distinction in the oral. "Are you planning to buy our Gillian?" Mac was standing at my elbow. Oh dear, I thought. I only had to talk to someone for 2 minutes before I'm being asked about my intentions. No, I don't think so, Mac. I haven't really thought about it. Anyway, my father doesn't have the bride price, which I'm sure would be high for such a nice girl. Yes, well, she is a nice girl. You could do a lot worse. Mac drifted off. 3.5 years of my contract were coming to an end, following which I was due for 6 months home leave. I had been giving some thought to this. On leaving England, I had had no real intention to burn all bridges. However, now my parents were separated, there was no family home anyway. My old school friends and farming pals would all be working during the day, so what would I do with myself for 6 months? I had been frightened and disenchanted by the fact that I seemed to have lost all rights of British citizenship. I had not been allowed the polio recovery facilities back in the UK that all the UK conscript had been flown home to. Neither the British Legion nor the Kenya governor was interested in my 16% disability. Yet I had only been in Kenya for a few months before I was called up. I had joined 100% fit and now had a disability which would threaten my earning ability at my chosen life, farming, and I could no longer play the piano or the clarinet. I looked around for a short-term job that could occupy me for 3 months, after which I would take my leave October to December. The job of a Nairobi driving instructor was offered. I would be paid, the hours would be easy, and Roy Ansell said I could lodge in his house in Quebec. The 3 months moved by happily, and at the end I was offered full-time work as a driving instructor. I turned it down. My puppy had settled in with Roy, so she could be left happy with him while I was in the UK. Meanwhile, at the end of July, Non and other friends had driven in convoy the 2,000 miles, as the crow flies, to Johannesburg in order to watch the Lions match against South Africa on the 6th of August. The Lions won 23-22, which was no reward for such camp follower devotion. Just imagine, I thought, it must have taken them all of a week to get there and another week to dry home, all for a rugby match. Then at the last minute I saw an advert for a 2-week locum farm manager near Nakuru. I went up there for an interview where, after 10 minutes, the charming old farmer offered me the post. I would live in the farmhouse and use all the staff and facilities as if I were the farmer himself. These were to be the 2 most enjoyable weeks, being my own boss. I experimented with the grass. In England I had noticed how vigorously grass would respond to the harrow. I got out the heaviest harrow and tore into the kikuyu grass. Kikuyu grass trails its roots underground, so there is no chance of killing it through rough cultivation. Months later, when I drove past, it seemed to me that the strip I had harrowed was now the best grass to be seen. I played some tennis at the NAC, where I started to sweat heavily. Dr. Moat, father of a regiment colleague, diagnosed a tick-borne Rift Valley fever. I had to take life easy for a few days on medication. Encouraged by my locum farm management fortnight, I went to see Terry Mitten Watson in Dundori. At over 8,000 feet, Dundori was on the Nakuru Tea Falls Road at the edge of the Rift Valley. It was mixed farming country, and the farm Terry had recently inherited was quite large, 1,500 acres. He was married with 3 children. The 5 of them and Terry's mother inhabited a large white elephant Tudor-style 2-story house with coachway arch that Terry's father had built in a fit of extravagance. It was envisaged that the manager would move into the mabati-roofed bungalow on a ridge some way across the farm. Terry was happiest with machinery and arable farming. He wanted someone to look after the cattle and the pyrethrum, which was much like strawberry culture with which I had been so familiar in the UK. It seemed a good match. We agreed I would start on the 1st of January 1956. In no time I was boarding the BOAC Vickers Viscount bound for UK and 3 months' leave. My home leave was worse than I had expected. I found Dad in one of his lunchtime pubs in the city and met his cronies there. Back in his office I stood in embarrassment as he wept with misery. Mum was living on a farm where she was in charge of a herd of pedigree pigs. I met Leo in town. Leo was a school holiday friend whom I had met at Richmond Ice Rink when we were teenagers. Captain of St Paul's School and at least one sport there, he had passed all exams without trouble. Training with the lifeguards during his national service, he had won the Sword of Honour. Later, with money bequeathed to him by his father, he had bought a place in Lloyd's Insurance. "Oh, do tell me of your stories in Africa," was his opening put-down remark, accompanied by an exaggerated yawn. Over our pub lunch, I mentioned that the Japanese seemed to be starting to build ships. "Oh, don't you worry, old boy. We charge them high insurance premiums," he replied. In other words, Lloyd's didn't think the Japanese could build seaworthy vessels. At the end of our hour together, Leo said, "Ian, I'd like your advice. I'm having a dispute with my partners." "What? I wouldn't worry about that. You name it, you can do it better." "Yes, maybe, but they want me to do a 4-day week." "What? I wish someone would ask me to do a 4-day week." No, you don't understand. I only come in 3 days a week." I rented a bubble car and went to see a long-time school friend, Ian Black. I tracked him down in Folkestone, where he was now a lawyer, apparently wallowing in professional luxuries, complaining about the shoddy work of the decorators he had employed for his apartments. Mum was again on the marriage trail for me. She introduced me to Paddy, the daughter of a top large white pig breeder. Paddy and I showed their pigs around to a few county shows. Paddy appeared on the TV show What's My Line? I bought myself a white DJ jacket for Kenya and we went dancing. The jacket created quite a stir at the young farmers' ball, and I heard the word spivvy being used to describe it. Paddy and I went to the Earl's Court Motor Show, where I astonished a car salesman by asking him what the height of the sump of his car was above the ground. He didn't have the slightest idea, and wasn't particularly interested when I explained that in my part of the world it was an important feature of a car. I remembered that Roots, the British car manufacturer, had entered 3 Sunbeam cars to the Coronation Safari in East Africa. Not one got halfway round. The Roots team manager had commented, "This is a car breaking course, we shan't be coming here again." In contrast, the Germans and French were finding the exposure of their cars' deficiencies of considerable interest. The weaknesses were revealed, and the German and French manufacturers then set about improving their models. What different reactions! So who was going to win the commercial war for world market shares? I was appalled at the British complacency. Soon the leave was finished. In due course a letter from Paddy followed, stating she was now engaged to an RAF officer named Bill something or other.